the most popular thesis for those that are in the correctional services, in the prison system, is the concept of entitlement, is that the bully is an example of an entitled or spoiled individual, a person who will get away with things. Certainly many of the delinquents were spoiled, that is, they were not adaptive. They have never learned, they have never adapted to not getting things their way. But this again, there are many, many spoiled brats who are not bullies at all. And to confuse spoiled brats with bullying is a big mistake. It doesn't come from there. And so I want to offer an alternative. I want to offer an attachment-based explanation. I'm going to call it the alpha askew thesis. For lack of any other words, the alpha askew. In other words, my thesis is that there are alpha instincts which are part of every single mammal, every single creature with a limbic system. And it is an aberration of alpha. It is where alpha goes awry that we have a problem. Now, alpha comes from the Greek alphabet. It's the first letter. And so it is a metaphor then for wanting to place it first, for being on top, for having the last word, for being best, for winning, for being able to dominate. And that is the alpha thesis. But in this, we're going to look for what is it that alpha is meant to do. Why do we have alpha instincts in us? And I'm going to take us through some background information here. And basically, I'm going to try to paint the picture. Each one of this would take a chapter in a book, but very quickly give a background information to build this. The thesis is incredibly simple, but there needs to be some background information. And the implications are also very, very, very clear. When you understand this thesis of where our energy needs to go. And so the background information is, first of all, we are all creatures of attachment. It's our preeminent need. And so when we look at something that is as ubiquitous as bullying, the logical explanation, just as we would with peer orientation, that it has something to do with the attachment instincts, because the attachment instincts affect everything. And so it is likely then that the bullying instinct is deeply rooted in instinct and emotion. This is the only thing that would explain the fact that we can find this in every single mammal. We can find examples of taking advantage of the weak, of dominating. We can find examples of exploiting the vulnerable in every single species. Secondly, as I said, attachment is the preeminent need and the most powerful force shaping personality. That this is there, so it is again likely that we would find it, that this is where the alpha instincts come from. Now, attachment is orchestrated by the limbic system of the brain. This means that we're likely to find its roots in emotion. And so the roots are deeply embedded in emotion. Now, we have to remember, when we use the term emotion as neuroscientists and as clinical psychologists, we're differentiating that from feelings. To feel in the English language is to feel one's emotion, but there are many emotions that we do not feel. To emotion means to emotion move. So it's that which moves us. It also means to be stirred up. And so as humans, we are incredibly emotional creatures, easily stirred up and easily moved. And so it's that we are moved to. And I worked with institutions full of bullies. And the bullies were on both sides, unfortunately, of the bars. Many of the correctional officers presented as such. And by far the majority of the kids. I worked first of all in federal, and then in provincial, and then finally in young offenders. And they were literally institutions of bullies. And all my experience with bullies and working with them is it was self-evident to them. They experienced, they were true to their instincts. This was very instinctive behavior. To take advantage of the vulnerable, to prey upon the weak, was absolutely self-evident. If they didn't do it, they were failing in themselves to take advantage of this opportunity. Everyone else appeared to be dumb to them. They could not see why others would not do the same thing, because if you don't do it to them first, they're going to do it to you. And so there was automatically self-evident, deeply embedded in instinct. The primary purpose of attachment is to facilitate dependence. Now this is key. This is a key understanding. Attachment is to create a context in which we can raise our young. What attachment needs to do is facilitate caretaking. And to facilitate caretaking, that's the primary purpose. It has to facilitate the dependence of one upon the other and the responsibility, the caretaking of one to the other. And so that is the primary responsibility. Now, this is where we have a hard time. John Bowlby, in his foreword to A Secure Base, and he was trying to get British acceptance to the idea of attachment. And he knew that attachment was about dependence. But he says in his foreword, I couldn't afford to broadcast it that much because the British were allergic to the construct of dependence. Already at that time, there was the idea that, that as soon as the infant, in fact, that was formalized by Watson in terms of the whole idea of thinking, as soon as a child is born, you must not do anything for a child that they could or should do for themselves, or else you'll spoil the whole process of them becoming viable as separate beings. And so dependence was never to be tolerated. You push towards independence, and this became the primary way of raising children. Again, the key thing was never do for a child what they could or should do for themselves. Don't pick them up if they can walk for themselves. Don't feed them if they can eat by themselves, and so on and so on. And that was the idea. And so Bowlby had a hard time of it, and he probably equivocated a little bit in terms of doing this, about being able to say, attachment is all about dependence. It's about getting one to depend upon the other. It's about getting one to take care of another. And so there are two sets of instincts here, two sets of drives. Now, Tokyo Doi, a Japanese attachment theorist, had no such problems. He never knew about Bowlby when he wrote his book in English. It's called Anatomy of Dependence. It was that clear. He never used the word attachment because he didn't know the word exist. But his whole book is about attachment. And because in Japan, it is okay to depend upon another. In fact, if you don't depend upon another when you really should depend upon another, there's a problem. In Japan, you're meant to make yourself sweet and easy to carry. And it's part of the dependence thing. If you need to be carried, and this is a primary thing among their aged, is that as life goes on and they become more dependent as they age, and their children need to take care of them, they need to make themselves easy to carry. Now, I wish our parents understood this. Our parents are very shamed by moving into the dependent stage, and they fight us tooth and nail when we need to take care of them. They don't know how to make themselves easy to carry. They have no sense of it. Why? Because there is no understanding of dependence in our culture. That we need to depend upon each other, that it's okay to depend upon each other. And children need to depend upon those who are responsible for them. So there was a problem. Tokyo Doi didn't have that problem. If you want to read a delightful book on attachment, read this book that's now translated into English. And so in keeping with this purpose of attachment, basically when you understand it and when putting all the pieces together, it comes down rather simply. Because attachment is to facilitate dependence, is to facilitate caretaking and to render receptive. That means that in attachment, it is divided into two sets of instincts. It means that when we come together, we don't come together in attachment ever as equals, because that's not what attachment is for. The fruit of attachment is to become your own person, and when you're your own person, you are biased to treat others as their own persons. That's the fruit of attachment, but that's not what childhood is about. When you're attached, and that's not ever what attachment is about, even in marriage. What attachment is about, when you come together, nature has a problem. How do you get a relationship to form? And nature's figured it out. You have two sets of instincts, and this exists in every single mammal. Two sets of instincts, and it's the first item of business. Nature needs to evoke alpha instincts in one and dependent instincts in another, and then a relationship forms.
Now you could use words instrumentally. Let's start with that. Imagine that you want something from someone, and then you might think, well, how can I phrase my argument so that I'm going to get that from this person? And then you might think, well, what sort of argument would appeal to that person, and what buttons can I push, and how can I get what I want? And then you're using words in an instrumental way. You're using them as tools to obtain what you desire from other people. Now, I think if you do that completely, you're a psychopath. I mean that because a psychopath has no room for you at all. It's about him or her. And you're there to be used as an instrumental target. Now, I'm not saying that every time someone uses language instrumentally, they're acting like a psychopath. But that's the logical conclusion to that form of language use. Now then you might think, well, you can imagine little kids trying to do that to their parents, right? Siblings will often collude. They'll have a little conspiratorial conversation about how to approach one parent or the other, usually by isolating the parents. That's a good strategy. And then they'll phrase their request so that they can extract out the desired benefit. And the fox is bragging away about some crooked thing that he's done and how he pulled the wool over someone's eyes, and he confuses that with wisdom and intelligence. And one of the things that you see, this is worth knowing too, because if you're preyed upon by a psychopath, which you will be to some degree at some point in your life, the psychopath, who will be narcissistic, will presume that you're stupid and that you deserve to be taken advantage of because you're naive and stupid. So it's actually a good thing that he's doing it. And his proof for, and I'm saying he because there are more male psychopaths, the proof that you're stupid, naive, is that he can take advantage of you. And so, like, if you were wiser, you'd be, you know, you'd know his tricks, and then it wouldn't be morally necessary for him to show you just exactly who knows what about what. And so the psychopath will use his ability to fool you as proof of his own grandiose omnipotence, omniscience, and narcissism. And the problem with that is that you can be fooled by a psychopath, and virtually anybody can. So that Robert Hare, for example, who studied psychopaths for a long time and interviewed a lot of them, like hundreds of them, and videotaped many of the interviews, he said when he was talking to the psychopath, he always believed what they were saying. And then he'd watch the video afterwards and see where the conversation went off the rails. But, you know, the proclivity to be polite in a conversation is very strong. And if you're polite, you don't object to the way that the person unfolds their strategy, you know. And psychopaths are pretty good at figuring out how to manipulate, obviously, how to manipulate people. And the probability that you will be immune to that is extraordinarily low.